did not have to talk about this. I wish I did not have to talk about what is happening in Syria. I would much rather talk about Egypt or civil rights or NSA and talk about Syria. But unfortunately, we are at a stage where 2 years into the Syrian conflict, the situation has just gotten magnified and it's gotten a lot worse. And the big question that we have to ask ourselves is, where do we stand? And here the we that I'm referring to is we Americans. So I'm taking off my Arab hat and putting on my American hat just to clarify the identity that I'm speaking from right now. So what is the position of the Obama administration? What is the position of Congress? What is the position of the American people with regards to what is happening in Syria? Where are we now and where do we want to go? And in a statement released by the president on June 13th, he made his position quite clear. And he said that it has been clear that the use of chemical weapons or the transfer of chemical weapons to terrorist groups is a red line for the United States, as there has long been an established norm within the international community against the use of chemical weapons. Our intelligence community now has a high confidence assessment that chemical weapons have been used on a small scale by the Assad regime in Syria. Now, setting aside the hypocrisy of any member of the US administration speaking out against chemical weapons usage without talking about our own historical use of chemical weapons, not only in times of war, but in times of peace. And I cannot but speak about Vieques in Puerto Rico, where they have had almost every single kind of weapon tested on them, with the exception of atomic weapons, has been tested on the people of Vieques in Puerto Rico. They've even had weapons tested on them that were not used in times of war because they found them to be too deadly and too potent. So I always find it to be a bit ironic and painful to hear a representative of the US government speak out against chemical weapons used by others without specifically apologizing for our own historical use. But setting that aside, if I could set that aside, just had to get that out, but set that aside. This is the position of the Obama administration. And because the Obama administration discovered that the Syrian government is using chemical weapons, the Obama administration then went on to say, okay, we've crossed this red line, so now we have to arm the rebels. So it makes me go, hold on a second. Let's talk about chemical weapons. You know, the Iraq War wasn't that long ago. We still remember how our president looked us in the face and looked the media in the face and blatantly told us that Iraq has weapons of mass destruction, which was, by the way, a term that that administration had come up with, weapons of mass destruction. And then we later found out that it was a complete lie. So I hope that we are equally skeptical about whenever any other member of our government talks about chemical weapons or any other weapons. So what of these chemical weapons? What of it? That's one question we're intending to answer here. And given that there is chemical weapons allegedly used by the Syrian government, the Obama administration then is to arm the Syrian rebels and to consider imposing a no-fly zone in Syria, which is specifically what Senator McCain wants, to impose a no-fly zone in Syria. Okay, so because of what has happened, then we need to impose a no-fly zone. Okay, so again, he's arguing that it's because there was chemical weapons used that we then need to do this armament. But if we look at their whole claim for chemical weapons, the claim for chemical weapons is that the Obama administration has evidence, that they have not given to anybody else to analyze, that they have not released the chain of custody for this evidence. We simply have to take their word for it, that immediately after their statement that if the Syrian government uses chemical weapons, that would be a red line, that somehow they got evidence that they have used chemical weapons. We're supposed to set aside the skepticism that the evidence for these use of chemical weapons was actually given to the US government by members of the so-called Free Syrian Army. We're supposed to set that aside. We're also supposed to set aside that back in early May, a month before the Obama administration made this very position, before they made this very position, back in early May, a top UN human rights investigator said that according to witness and victim testimonies, the UN has, and I quote, strong concrete suspicions that rebels have been using sarin gas, that rebels have been using chemical weapons. So would that be a red line for President Obama? Since he clearly says here, the transfer of chemical weapons to terrorist groups is a red line for the United States. So would that be a red line if the rebels are proven to have used chemical weapons? And what red line would that intake? What action would the US government then be forced to do if it's proven that the rebels have used chemical weapons? So again, the UN said that there's strong suspicion to this back in early May. There was no response from the Obama administration.
A month later, the Obama administration said they found evidence that the Syrian government used chemical weapons. Yesterday, just yesterday, the Russian ambassador at the United Nations presented evidence to the Secretary General of the United Nations that now, with samples taken by the Russians themselves at the very site at which the Obama administration accuses the Syrian government of using chemical weapons, that very site, okay, they've taken samples, they've done the research in a Russian lab, they've given this samples with the evidence to the United Nations, and the conclusion is, according to the Russians, that the rebels used sarin gas, and not that the Syrian government used it because of the particular makeup of the sarin gas. The US response was, and I quote, "We have yet to see any evidence that backs up the assertion that anyone besides the Syrian government has the ability to use chemical weapons or has used chemical weapons." So basically, they're at the standstill. So at the very least, we can say that the allegation of chemical weapons is questionable, if not refutable. And again, we need to ask our president a very specific question. How much proof would he need to say that the rebels have used it? And if there is proof that the rebels have used it, what then? What does that mean if the rebels cross the red line? Which then means, what does this mean for arming the rebels? And when we look at this, arming the Syrian rebels, the big question is, which rebels? And there's a lot of questions as to what kind of rebels need to be armed, what kind of arms should they be given? And the Obama administration responds, and Senator McCain loves to make these statements, that it's very clear to differentiate between a good rebel and a bad rebel. That somehow they're going to vet the rebels. That this is their language. How are they going to vet them? I don't know. Somehow they're going to vet them. Okay? Which then leads us to go, okay, who are they actually arming? And to be able to answer this question of who are they arming, we need to step back and say, who's actually in the battlefield in Syria? Who's on the ground? Who's doing the fighting? I mean, we know that the Syrian Arab Army is there, of course. So the army of the Syrian government is there. We know they're there. But who else is in the battlefield? What is this so-called Free Syrian Army? Now, when we hear the term Free Syrian Army, at least the first time I heard the term Free Syrian Army, I thought of an army with a hierarchy, a clear hierarchy, with a clear leadership, with a top-down command structure. That's completely false. There is no such thing. It's an umbrella movement that's become more of a slogan. It's become much more of a label by various different opposition groups that work together, sometimes that fight against each other, sometimes that have different visions most of the time, and that share this label of the Free Syrian Army. But let's even look at it more specifically. I don't know if you all can be able to see this, but The Economist published this in May, an examination of who's who in the Syrian battlefield. And if we look at it, we see that 1 and 2 and 3 and on and on and on, all of them, with one exception, are so-called Islamist militants. And I really don't like the term Islamist, just like I don't like the term Christian militants or Jewish militants, because I feel that it's an offense to the religion itself. So here, these are people who claim to be Islamist and who claim to be speaking in one way or another a particular verse of what they consider to be Islam. Okay? That's the majority of them. So there is this group and this narrative that we can arm the secular rebels. We can arm the secular rebels, okay? The secular rebels happen to be under General Salim Idris, the very first guy who's a defector from the Syrian army, who claims to be secular, and who also has the least control on the ground, and who has the greatest number of defections. Okay? And he claims to be secular, and that could be up for question. We could discuss that in the Q&A. So we basically are, the Obama administration wants to arm one of these guys in one way or another, okay? Of these, the strongest, according to so many reports, but I'm just quoting the most mainstream of them, which is the CNN security clearance, the strongest, most equipped, most organized, most financed group that is right now on the battlefield in Syria is a group that's called Al-Nusra Front. Okay. Al-Nusra Front is the most organized group. And who is Al-Nusra Front? They have been designated by the US State Department as being a terrorist group back in December 2012. They were designated by the United Nations Security Council as being a terrorist group in May 2013, because they're on the record as saying that they have direct affiliation with what is known as Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Okay, so we have them being designated by 2 communities as being a terrorist organization. We also know that they have as many as 10,000 fighters, and these are direct quotes from CNN here, and that they are making desperate attempts to get chemical weapons, specifically sarin gas. We also know that the Obama administration wants to arm rebels because the Syrian government has allegedly used chemical weapons, specifically sarin gas. Now, more powerfully onto all of this is this aspect. So we know that we have the strongest, most equipped, most disciplined militant brigade in that region is what is considered by the US State Department to be a terrorist organization. We also know that this strongest brigade has the largest number of defections from the so-called secular branches of this umbrella slogan group called the Free Syrian Army. Okay? That they have extraordinary numbers of defections, and they defect for 2 reasons, and these people are on the record as to why they defect. They defect, 1, because they're the guys with the weapons and the FSA doesn't have them, and 2, because they're the guys with the discipline, and it's run much more like an army. Okay? And furthermore, because of what is happening with Al-Nusra Front, we have on the record, and these are, I'm specifically using the headlines from US newspapers and US magazines to show that what I'm presenting is actually the mainstream. I'm not presenting things that are left of center. I'm presenting the mainstream. And what the mainstream is arguing is that now, because of Al-Nusra Front, and because of other militants that are actually, get this, to the right of Al-Nusra Front, that are more right-wing and repressive than this one Al-Qaeda militant organization in Syria, okay? That now Syria has become, according to numerous different American papers, the training grounds for, so to speak, jihadists. I hate the term jihadist that is used in the US press because it's a complete misuse of that beautiful word, okay? But nevertheless, the way that they're saying it is now there's 6,000 people that go from various different countries in Europe and North Africa and the Arab Gulf into Syria to be trained in these techniques. And when they say these techniques include suicide bombs, include car bombs, include various different kinds of torture and killings. Okay? And again, this is what they're on the record for saying. And also when we claim, at least when the Obama administration claims that they are secular elements of the Free Syrian Army, one of the very founders of the Free Syrian Army has gone on the record as saying that he welcomes, and this is a direct quote, Al-Nusra Front on the battlefield and has described them as our brothers in Islam. And he described them as our brothers in Islam even after they openly committed massacres. And what of their massacres? What of these statements of these rebels? What are they on the record for saying? For those of you who read Arabic, I hope you notice the irony in this. And for the rest, I'm going to go ahead and read it to you. You have this boy right here is holding a sign that says, La lil-ta'ifiyya, no to sectarianism. Okay, so far so good. So one would imply yes to inclusiveness. But what's written right underneath it, بدنا نبيد العلوية والشيعة. We want to exterminate the Alawis and the Shias. So, no to division, I want to kill everybody. Okay, this is basically an open statement within one of the various protests for the supporters of Al-Qaeda. And Al-Qaeda, which previous to a few years ago, had barely any support within Syria. I need to stop and say this, and I was having a discussion earlier today about this. We have 2 various factions right now on the battlefield in Syria. You have on one aspect the Syrian army and the other militant organizations that are in support of the Syrian army. And you have on the other hand the various different brigades and militant groups under the so-called rubrics of the opposition. Both have been regarded by the latest United Nations report as having committed war crimes and having committed atrocities. Both are condemned for that. But when we look at their writings and when we look at their actions, only one of them can be condemned for having the intention to commit genocide. And I use that term very specifically. The act of genocide is the act of specific killing of a group of people because of their identity, be it religion, be it ethnicity, be it color, etc. Okay? So when we have organizations that are upfront about wanting to kill people because of their religious identity, that takes it to a whole other level of atrocity. Now you may say, you know, that's just one poster. Why am I just talking about one poster? I'm not just talking about one poster. I just specifically do not want to show pictures of bloodshed. I specifically do not want to show pictures of horror, and this is the least horrific picture that I can show. There have been numerous massacres that have been committed. With the latest massacre that was committed in Hatla in Syria is a massacre that one of the brigades of, again, the so-called Free Syrian Army actually openly gloated about and took responsibility for. And this was a massacre that was made one day after one of the so-called sheikhs in Saudi Arabia issued a fatwa in which he specifically called for, in a YouTube video, the slaughter of women and children who are Shia. The specific slaughter of women and children who are Shia. And it wasn't enough that he said kill them. He actually took 15 minutes to describe how they should be killed, which I'm not going to tell you what he said. The very next day, 60 women and children, unarmed, in Hatla were massacred. No bullets were used. They were all killed by knife. Okay. And one of these groups claimed responsibility and gloated about it. That's one of those massacres. You may also have heard about a soldier of the Syrian army who was killed and whose chest was opened up and whose lung and heart were removed and they were eaten. And so there was a member, again, open member, identifies himself as a member of the Free Syrian Army who on YouTube literally bit into this man's lung. And that video got circulated extensively. It got circulated extensively to the point that Putin actually went on record as speaking to a British representative at the latest meeting, and he said, "You want to arm people who eat people's lungs." And there was no response given to that statement. Now the BBC, though, decided to take it a step further, and the BBC decided to interview this man. And they decided to interview this man and to humanize this crime that he had committed, to humanize it by asking him what has led him to commit this crime. And he said, you know, my family has been killed by the Syrian army. But then he went forward and he said, but I could commit more atrocities. And then there's this story of Muhammad Qatta. Muhammad Qatta's mother, this is Muhammad Qatta. He's a 14-year-old boy. Sources say he's 15. 14, 15-year-old boy who was regarded as a drummer boy of the so-called revolution. And in Halab, which is an area right now in Syria, known as Aleppo in English, that has been under the control of the rebel forces for approximately a year now. While he was working in a cafe there, one of the members of the so-called Free Syrian Army Brigade asked him for coffee and refused to pay. And he said, loan it to me. And Muhammad Qatta said, even if you were the Prophet Muhammad, I would not accept a loan for you. We need to be paid. And so this man took it upon himself to teach this boy a lesson because he accused him of blasphemy. And in front of his father, he whipped him. And then when his mother heard her cries, she heard one bullet and then another bullet, and by the time she got to the top of her house to see what's happened, she saw that her son had been shot point blank twice, and then the jeep in which these rebels were driving actually drove over her son. These rebels weren't even Syrian. They were likely Chechen because of the accent in which they spoke Arabic. And these were former rebel supporters in a rebel stronghold. And this was one of the boys that was killed. You may have heard of the public beheading of a Catholic priest. And this priest now, it's also made the stories in US press, and there have been clergy in the United States for protest about it. And I'm sorry for being so grotesque, but I'm trying to, there's a level of atrocity that I find to be hard to accept. I mean, coming from Lebanon where war is present, and in the United States where our country is also militarized, I'm used to guns and bombs. I'm not used to knives. And so when I heard that this Catholic priest was beheaded, I thought, beheaded, French style. And then I looked it up and it was no, he was beheaded with a knife. So we have these stories, numerous individual crimes, numerous mass crimes, and open declarations of wanting to commit further crimes. And then we have these. This was just out yesterday. Within certain areas that have become rebel strongholds, now there's a blockade that they are enforcing. a blockade. So now there's a limit of food, there's extraordinary increases of inflation, and this is one of the signs that they have put up, which is it is not allowed to distribute food, medicine, oil, baby stuff, milk and dairy products, vegetables, meat, bread, etc. outside of this rebel stronghold area. So if you are a Syrian who happens to live within one area that's under the control of the rebels, and you have family that lives in another area that's not under control of the rebels, you cannot give them food, nor can they give you food. And what I always wonder is, okay, I come from a background that is against the Syrian government. It's against the Syrian government because of their long history of economic corruption, because of their long history of political detention, because of their human rights violation, because of their participation with the US government in rendition, because of so many other factors. I have stood against Bashar al-Assad and Hafiz al-Assad before him because they are ultimately a dictatorship that lacks transparency and accountability, as dictatorships do. But if I want to overthrow my government, there are means and ways to do so, and there are means and ways that if I were to employ, then I would basically be destroying the very country I claim to want to salvage. And I believe this is what they are doing. And it is not just what I believe. I mean, when we have, in the same day, actually yesterday, a rebel commander in Aleppo said, and I quote, "It was time to start shelling civilian areas to raise pressure on Assad." And we know what the definition of terrorism is. The US legal code itself defines terrorism as any act done to coerce a civilian population in order to get a change in government. Any act to intimidate or coerce a civilian population in order to get a change in governmental policy. That is how we in the United States define terrorism, at least legally. And so when we have a rebel commander saying specifically, it is time to start shelling civilian areas in order to pressure the Syrian government, that is by definition terrorism. By definition, terrorism. And this is what they are claiming, and this is what they want. So what is their intention, these rebels? As reported in the New York Times in an op-ed piece on June 23rd, they report this. And I want to quote this at length from what the writer said. After the defeat of Assad, this FSA spokesperson predicts a second, quote, sectarian war with the Alawite minority in Syria. One presumes in this scenario that the FSA has both defeated the army's relatively powerful military and also routed Hezbollah. The writer of this op-ed said that he was impressed with the disarming candor of the spokesperson. And the spokesperson goes on and to say, it would take 3 wars to complete the Syrian revolution. 1 to defeat Assad, then a sectarian war within Islam between the Sunnis and the Shia, and then a fight over just how Islamic the new Syria will be. This is their own words, on record, as printed in the New York Times, except the New York Times journalist appreciated, and I quote, their disarming candor, rather than be repelled by their open statements calling for war and division. So who among them does the Obama administration want to arm? And for what objective? The Obama administration and their supporters, including McCain, including Bill Clinton, claim that they can distinguish between the, quote, good guys and the, quote, bad guys. And if they can't distinguish, they're just going to ask them politely. The Defense Department is on record as seeking assurances from Syrian opposition leaders that US-provided weapons to rebels in the country will not end up in the hands of Islamic militants. In other words, the position of the Obama administration is please say you're not going to share the weapons we give you with people that we don't like. That's it. Just please say it. Now, we also have to remember and take a step back and examine what the US government has done previously and who the US government has supported previously. And I cannot help but remember that the US government has furnished arms and training to other rebels, the Nicaraguan Contras in the 1980s and the Mujahideen fighting the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan. And we know very well what the Nicaraguan Contras did in Nicaragua and who they considered to be fair targets in Nicaragua. And we know very well what has been the conclusion of the arming and training of the Mujahideen in Afghanistan. So, forgive me for being a bit skeptical. But the skepticism isn't just limited to us. Even German Chancellor Angela Merkel has been quoted in the Associated Press on June 27th as saying, and I quote, "The risks in sending weapons to the rebels would be incalculable." And she's no left-wing progressive human rights supporter. More powerfully, UN says the same thing. The chairman of the United Nations Independent Panel investigating possible violations of human rights in Syria went on record on June 21st as saying it is impossible to choose unequivocally good guys among the groups of Syrian rebels and send weapons to them. Those arms will contribute to the escalation of war crimes and gross human rights violations. Very clear statements from people on the ground. So then we have to ask, okay, I really don't think that the Obama administration is that ignorant. They must know what they're doing. They must have an objective. What are they on record as wanting out of this? And on the record, the United States Secretary of State John Kerry stated on June 21st that he wants to send arms to the rebels, and I quote, "to be able to address the imbalance on the ground." To address the imbalance on the ground, which in the words of Henry Kissinger means, let them just kill each other, which was what Henry Kissinger wanted to be the outcome of the Iraq-Iran war. To address the imbalance on the ground. Those are really, really horrifying statements right there. Now, there is good news amidst all this. The good news is that Congress is not just taking it all. Congress has not been reassured by the administration. A bipartisan group of senators and representatives has introduced legislation that would expressly prohibit the Obama administration from intervening militarily in Syria's so-called proxy war without explicit congressional authorization. It's also known as the Welch-Udall, and I specifically want to recognize Congressman Walter Johns, a Republican from North Carolina, from being one of the signatories of that. So we have Representatives Peter Welch, Democrat from Vermont, Chris Gibson, a Republican from New York, Rick Nolan, a Democrat from Minnesota, our own Walter Jones, Republican, and Michelle Bachmann, another Republican from Minnesota. They're the ones that introduced House Resolution 2494. And in the Senate, we have Tom Udall, Democrat from New Mexico, Chris Murphy, Democrat from Connecticut, Rand Paul, colorful Republican from Kentucky, and Mike Lee, Republican from Utah. Bipartisan support. Why bipartisan? I mean, we would understand the Republicans just having a knee-jerk reaction to anything Obama does, but the fact that the Democrats are also signing on raises a question. So why would they do that? Two very clear reasons, I think. One is because they're reading the same reports that I just quoted, and they also don't like this idea of supporting the very people that they themselves consider to be terrorists. And arguably more importantly, Congress is much more sensitive to poll work than the president is. Actually, Bill Clinton is quite upset at the president for even paying any attention to the polls, because Bill Clinton has gone on the record as saying that Obama should not even pay attention to the polls. So what are the polls saying? 70% of Americans polled said they oppose providing military support to opposition forces in Syria, even if the Syrian government is found to be guilty of using chemical weapons. This was a poll from June 17th. Another poll conducted in May 4th said only 12% of Americans support arming the rebels if it is proven that the Syrian government has used chemical weapons. This is their own language. This is a strong, loud cry coming from the general American public saying no to arming them. So while Congress has not yet acted to restore their own checks and balances on military interventions, although they are definitely on the right track, and while, as of yesterday, the congressional committees, the two congressional committees, one in the House and one in the Senate, bipartisan congressional committees, are holding up a plan to send US weapons to Syria, could we say then that there are no US weapons in Syria? Because Congress has said no, even the congressional committees have said no. The answer is no. The US is already involved. According to the Los Angeles Times, according to the Wall Street Journal, according to the New York Times, the United States has secretly provided arms training to Syrian rebels since 2012. Since 2012, there have been training bases in Jordan and Turkey under direct presidential approval. Since 2012. And these training bases include more than 300 Marines. And as reported by the Wall Street Journal on June 26th, the CIA is now, quote, considering putting US military special operations force units under agency authority to conduct some of the training. Now, having just read Jeremy Scahill's excellent book, Dirty Wars, and seen his documentary, Dirty Wars, I read Special Operation Force Unit, and my mind was like, JSOC? Is JSOC in Syria? The Joint Special Operations Command, are they in Syria? So I did a teeny bit of research, not that much, and I found a Washington Post article that said that yes, JSOC has been in Syria since 2003. That according to this book, Top Secret America, The Rise of the New American Security State, JSOC has been active in Syria since 2003. And their activity in Syria requires presidential approval. So they have had the presidential approval of 2 presidents to operate in Syria. Now, given what we know from Dirty Wars, we know what JSOC actually does. JSOC is on the record as saying that they do targeted assassinations, but there's a question as to how their targets are chosen, because that's quite questionable. They do arrest, they do interrogation, they do torture, they do kidnapping. This is what they're on the record as doing. So who have they actually been killing and assassinating and detaining and torturing in Syria since 2003? I really don't know. But I remember one quote by a JSOC operator from the movie Dirty Wars. And this JSOC operator said, and I'm quoting him here, "We are now seeing effects of covert intervention without thought of future repercussions, given that JSOC is now operating in 75 countries around the world. Hundreds of concurrent operations, all without oversight of Congress." This JSOC operator continues, and I quote, "Congress does not want to step into the dark. Billions are poured into JSOC. We have created a hammer. For the rest of my lifetime, this force will be continually searching for a nail." So is that the other objective in Syria? To find a bigger nail for JSOC? I don't know. Meanwhile, we have suffering in Syria. And there's a number that has been presented a great deal in the mainstream press, and that number has been presented as justification for so-called humanitarian military intervention by the United States. And that number is that there have been 100,000 fatalities. And if you just read that number in the press, one would logically assume that the 100,000 fatalities have all been at the hands of the Syrian army. Okay. So we broke this down a bit. Right? According to sources by the Center for Documentation of Violations, the Syrian Observatory for Human Rights, which is a pro-opposition organization, the Syrian Network for Human Rights, and the United Nations, they list the casualties from March 2011 till July of 2013 as ranging from 76,000 to 100,000. They also recognize that among those casualties, there are approximately 42,900 pro-Syrian government combatants. So we have approximately 43,000 of that 100,000 number that are actually members of the Syrian army, or supporters, armed supporters of the Syrian army. As for the anti-Syrian government combatants, okay, the Syrian Human Rights Observatory went on record as saying that they consider any civilian who holds up arms and dies in combat to still be a civilian, which is something that we should pause at. If they themselves say that any individual who holds up arms, who is not himself a defector of the Syrian army, and holds up arms against the Syrian army and dies in battle, is recognized as a civilian. And yet they said that, you know, we may need to double this figure that we've listed as anti-Syrian government combatants. So we have a range between 10,000 to 43,000 people have been killed, armed rebels, which leaves civilian deaths to be somewhere between 2,000 to 43,000. I don't want to minimize this number in any way, but I do want to just point out one additional number. From this number here, the number of known dead of the Syrian, anti-Syrian government rebels, there are 43 different nationalities. 43 different nationalities of people that are fighting on the side of the rebels. And these countries are primarily Libyan, Tunisian, Saudis, Chechens, Jordanians, but also a large number of them come from the former Soviet Union. Another significant number of them come from Western Europe. And there's even one American that was thrown in there. So we've got 43 different nationalities in terms of the rebels that have been killed. But even that doesn't really say anything about the suffering. And I think if we want to talk about the suffering, we've got several different numbers that we need to present. There's the number of refugees, 1 out of 4. 1 out of 4 Syrians is now a refugee, either internally displaced or a refugee outside of his or her country. And to be a refugee is one of the worst things a person could suffer from. Because that Syrian refugee would either have to be in a camp in Jordan called Zaatari camp, which is known by the United Nations to be quite tragic, or to be in Lebanon where there are no camps, or to be in Turkey where the camps are militarized, or now they can no longer go to Egypt because Egypt has closed its border to all Syrians. So they are suffering. Now the suffering gets compounded if they happen to be one of the 500,000 Palestinian refugees in Syria, because they are not welcome anywhere. They have nowhere to go. So that's the refugees. And then you have an entire generation of Syrian children that are now traumatized. Close to 4 million children need direct humanitarian assistance. You have the entire Syrian infrastructure has been destroyed. And I don't use that term lightly. Let me just share with you a few numbers. More than 1/3 of all hospitals have closed. More than 2/3 of all health workers have fled. The pharmaceutical factories that Syria was known for. I mean, in Lebanon, Lebanese would go to Syria to get cheap generic medicine because the Syrian government had so wisely argued with the pharmaceutical companies to ensure that they are able to produce generic drugs in Syria. But those pharmaceutical factories have all been destroyed. Why? The textile factories have all been destroyed. The agriculture is now in a very dire situation. And meanwhile, the United Nations is on record as saying that 4 million people could starve. 4 million people could go hungry in Syria. And they have issued appeal after appeal after appeal, from the Food and Agricultural Organization to the World Food Program to other United Nations agency, asking for money. And they've barely gotten half of what they're asking for. And somehow, the Qataris and Saudis and the American government are finding money for military support, but no money for humanitarian support. It is a tragedy what's happening in Syria. There's no question. It is a tragedy. It's also a crime, of which there are numerous international actors at play. And so then the question becomes, what is our position and where will we stand as Americans in this tragic proxy war that's taking place in Syria? And my recommendation is that when it comes to Syria, our demand should be very clear. No, not just to US arming of the rebels, but no to any arming of the rebels, which means that if the US government considers Qatar and Saudi Arabia to be allies, then the US government is in a particular position to pressure Qatar and Saudi Arabia, which are prime funders of the rebels, to stop funding the rebels. This is not a conflict that can ever be won militarily. It can only be dealt with politically. It can only be dealt with politically. There can be no victory through military violence in Syria for any side. So there needs to be a lot of pressure to make sure that there will be negotiations between Syrians for Syrians. And I think as Americans, we need to shoot high, which means we need to demand an end to JSOC. We need to demand a dismantling of JSOC. We need to make people be really aware that we have a military wing that operates covertly and secretly under direct presidential authority in more than 73 countries without a declared state of war. That's a horror story right there. We need to demand domestically for congressional oversight, not presidential secrecy. We need to demand domestically for public debates, not lies and misinformation. We need to recognize that the trillion-dollar military hammer that the Obama administration has empowered more than the Bush administration, according to the JSOC operators themselves, that this trillion-dollar military hammer will always need a nail unless we dismantle it from its core. And we need to constantly be demanding, and this is the power that we have in the United States more than elsewhere, to each other and to our press and to our congressmen, that just because we carry a blue US passport does not make our lives more worthy than any other life. And until we get that basic idea really recognized in the press and in our Congress, we have got a long way to go. Which also means that for us in North Carolina, we need to bring the war home linguistically. I emphasize linguistically. Which means what is the relationship between what the Obama administration is doing overseas and what the Obama administration is doing domestically with regards to violation of our Fourth Amendment rights with NSA surveillance? What is the relationship between what the Obama administration is doing overseas with what certain legislatures are doing in different states across the union for dismantling unemployment, for increasing privatization of prisons, for dismantling public education? Is there a link there? Does it show a certain position that government after government, administration after administration, Democrat or Republican, have continued to say yes to the military budget and no to every other budget? So that becomes our onus. Thank you so much for your time, and I apologize again for being the purveyor of sad news.